very honoured to have the opportunity to have a chat with Penelope Roskell about her new book, The Complete Pianist. Now, Penelope, was this book born out of frustration?
Yeah, there were quite a lot of frustrations that's led to the creation of this book. It's taken me 15 years to write. I suppose the first thing was when I was a student, I um, hurt my hand um,
Hmm.
because there was no sound advice at that time about how we should look after our hands, injury prevention, or what to do when you do injure your hands. I was playing Liszt concerto. I was practicing for hours and hours without a break. My technique for octaves wasn't right, wasn't good. So I hurt my hand. The advice was, oh, well, if you hurt, that's probably normal. You just continue. So I continued. So for several months, I was off playing completely, and it just kept, the twinges kept coming back for several years afterwards. It really impacted on my playing. So that was the first one. It was the feeling that when somebody has an injury, there's not people out there who can help them with it. Then there was also the sort of practical things was when I was young, there were these wonderfully inspiring books, The Art of Piano Playing or The Teaching of Artificial Novel and the books by so many great pianists, which inspired you and were musically wonderful, but they didn't give you that practical advice about how
Mm,
to solve
mm,
each of those individual problems that we come across as day by day,
mm.
both as players and as teachers. And also, some of the books were by great, great teachers, people like Mate, for instance, which are just terribly difficult to understand. The
Yes.
language is difficult to understand. I confess to this. They're not, it's not easy to understand the written word when you're talking about sound and movement and piano playing is about creating sound and creating movement that creates certain sounds.
And that's, I suppose, why you did all these videos.
That's why I've got lots of videos. So it's got 300 videos in it which explain all the points that I've been making in the text. So the publishers, it's being published by Peter's Edition,
Hmm.
and they asked me to do two things. One, to write it for in a way that anybody who didn't have access to videos would be able to understand it. So I tried to make all the wording really clear, simple, straightforward, so that everybody could understand the exercises and what I was saying by just reading the text. But obviously, if you've got access to the videos, then that really just helps to show the movement, to hear the sound the effect that it has on the sound, and so on.
Mm, mm.
So it's a very practical book. Everything's got exercises to demonstrate something. So they're very simple exercises that you can use at any level.
So, what sort of level is it for?
Right. Well, this big standard book um, is aimed more for sort of grade 5 plus. Um, so it's aimed for teachers, professionals, amateurs, anybody who's a real enthusiast on the piano.
Hmm.
Now, at the moment, for real beginners, it's quite a challenging and quite a daunting sort of book because, as you can see, it's really thick, it's big, it's 550 pages, it covers everything. So, for a beginner, what I strongly recommend is that they work on it alongside their teacher. So, say a beginner's got a problem and the teacher's struggling with it and doesn't quite know the best way to deal with it, what they can do is look up that section in the book, try the exercises themselves, and then try them with the student, a week or two
Mm,
later,
mm.
they really absorbed it, and to use it in that way. Um, I mean, there are exercises for beginners throughout the book, and what I've done for each chapter is the beginning of each chapter is taking the fundamental problem, explaining how we work on it, um, and how some very simple exercises that anybody can do, even beginners, to work on it. But then, of course, the chapters go on to sort of intermediate level, how we do it more refined, more advanced, and more varied. And then, obviously, there's some examples also from the actual concert repertoire for much more advanced pianists. So there is something for everybody. But I think for beginners, the easiest way is that they work on it with the advice of their teacher so they don't get
Right.
overwhelmed by the size of the book. And
Yes, of course.
task, my next task is to pull out the most important things for the beginners so that a beginner has something which is much more manageable and they can
Mm.
work from that. So that's the next stage on. Haven't got there yet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. So I really liked your discussion about healthy technique and in particular, sort of the whole body approach. I love a whole body approach
There you
for
do. Yeah.
teaching piano.
Yeah.
So, you know, what sort of what would you suggest that teachers do with beginner students? So take for example, I don't know, maybe teaching staccato or legato playing, or really basic things that they might find in a grade 1 exam. What would you suggest for a teacher?
Rather than specific things like staccato and legato for a particular exam, I'd like to just talk perhaps about the specific aspects of playing that I think a teacher could have usefully have in mind
Hmm.
when they're teaching a beginner. And one of the first things, I'm going to start from a sort of much more general point and then perhaps come down to some more specific things. So I think the first thing to do is to just keep checking out their posture once in a while.
Mm.
Because obviously a teenager is going to sit with a sort of bored posture. Somebody who's very uptight might sit with a very tense posture. Um, and I find as a teacher, I'm often moving around the room. I don't always sit in exactly the same place. I might sit a
Mm.
little bit further away, might sit in the opposite side of the room while I hear them play a piece, perform a piece to me and things like that. And that really helps. Sometimes I might even sit behind them because then you pick up on things that you might not have noticed otherwise. So because if they've got an obvious really bad postural issue, like sort of, really tensing up their
Mm.
shoulders as they play or something, if you can pick up on those really early on, then you can prevent that issue becoming a long-term problem, which means that they don't have that horrible business later on of trying to sort of change a really ingrained long-term habit. So posture is a really useful thing
Hmm.
looking at. I think when we so that's a whole body issue, obviously, because
Absolutely.
I don't know whether you found this, but if you're actually sitting comfortably, then the hands feel a lot more comfortable. As soon as you're really tensing your back, it really affects the hands and the arms. It affects everything further down.
I totally agree with that. I suppose since we've had lockdown, what we've been discovering is how our students are sitting at their pianos
Absolutely.
and being, oh my gosh, being horrified at some of
Yes.
the, oh, I know why you're not playing very well now.
Yeah. And also what the quality of their pianos are. You suddenly
I
realize
know.
again. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we've all noticed that and discovered that. I think other things. So, for instance, another really important thing to look out for right from the beginning is the angle of the arm and the what I call the alignment. Um, so, for instance, because so many of the tutor books start on. I'm just going to actually point it down so you can see my arms at the moment. They start it with everything in middle C position. Um, so we are in a very peculiar alignment here. This is twisted this way a little bit, and then it's sort of twisting this way, and then the elbows being held in. Whereas what we want to be doing is feeling that we're using the natural alignment of the arm.
Mm, mm.
We want to bring the arms up into a very natural position, which means that it's really advantageous if you say have been doing an exercise here to then say, well, can you play it out here? Can you play it out here? So they're always reverting to a much more natural position.
Yes.
Otherwise, they start, and maybe for several weeks, they're playing very much in this position, the C, middle C position. And then they get a little bit stuck in that position. And so that when they go out, they sort of go out in this position. And you see how uncomfortable that looks. The shoulders are a bit tight, the elbows are a bit tight in. Um, the hand is not lined in a straight line with the forearm. What's really, really useful is to try and make sure they're not only in that position, but they're really using the whole range of the keyboard. And you
Mm,
can
mm.
right, can you play that right up at the top? Can a bird be singing that? Can an elephant be singing it down there? Um, and so you're moving around the keyboard as much as possible because what we're trying to do at the early stages is to get the freedom of movement.
Mm.
And that's a difficult thing to balance with the problem of the note reading, which tends to be let's start from 2 or 3 notes and then expand out from there. But I think to always say, right, we played it on starting on middle C. Can you now play it starting on the C above or the C above that? Or can you play it on black notes so that we're keeping the freedom of movement between the white, black, white. I'll just show you. So what we want to do is to get real freedom of movement forwards and back as well. And in order to do that, we've got to have a really soft elbow.
Yes.
So if at the beginning we add in some movements from white notes to black notes, we're keeping that elbow nice and fluid. Otherwise, the danger is we get stuck in one position, the elbow gets a bit tight here, it gets fixed. And then when we try to get to the black notes, I'll even show you here. So we're in a very awkward position here. And then to get to the black notes, we sort of stick out the finger to reach out to there, which means that the hand's in a very clawed position. These are too curved, these are too straight. It's very difficult to play evenly in that way. So we want to be in a position where we can easily just move between the white notes, the black notes, and that the elbow is really soft, and we can do that really quickly. So we can move around quickly.
That's very, very useful. I suppose seating position will be really important in that, in terms of seat height and feet on the floor and those sorts of part of the posture as well.
Yeah. That's really important. I think being at the right height, exactly what you're saying. I mean, they're all on these sort of little keyboards at home at the moment, and you actually got a chance to see what they're working on at home. Because a lot of people teach that the arm should be coming straight down, and there's a 90-degree angle at the elbow. I think that's too much of an angle. And what happens then is you can't get past your body. You can't move around very easily.
Yes.
I'm in a position where I'm at about parallel with the floor here. But then I move back several inches just to sort of allow more freedom here. So I've got more space to cross over the body and to get around the keyboard much more easily. And it actually, if that means that you are slightly sloping downwards, that's not a problem, because it means that the sort of energy and the flow and the arm weight really come down into the keys.
Yes.
Much more effectively. They really actually reach into the use of the fingertips, rather than feeling that all the weight just sort of drops into the elbow and you've got nothing here.
So, Penelope, tell me about sort of up and down movement and arm weight in terms of the seating position.
I think one of the most important things is to have a well-coordinated arm. Now, when I'm thinking about beginners, I'm also thinking about where they may be in 5 or 10 years' time, and that they'll be using more advanced techniques, and they'll be trying to get a forte chords, for instance. Now, when they're using forte chords, they want to be using the whole arm. They want to be getting the power from the upper arm, rather than to be pushing and putting a lot of pressure onto these poor little fingers, which aren't really designed for taking a lot of pressure. So I think that's something we can teach right from the early stages, really effectively, actually. So again, we're using a very coordinated movement right from the early stages for even playing single notes and for playing chords. I talk about this in quite some detail in the book. I call it the parachute touch.
Mm-hmm.
The parachute touch comes down really gradually, floats down onto the keys and sinks down, and it's a whole arm movement. So right from the early stages, we're teaching them to play very cantabile and beautifully coordinated chords, which is quite different from the idea of just sort of pushing into the keys and pressing in, which tends to tighten up the wrist. This parachute touch literally took me 40 years to work it out. When I was a new teacher, I really struggled with teaching how to use arm weight. And I think all new teachers do. I think it's one of the hard things to really teach, or it seemed to be at the time. And the first time I taught it, I thought, wow, I've got really, really successful. And this boy got really heavy touch. And then his playing became so heavy and so lethargic. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I took taken to the top opposite extreme, and I don't know how to get him back again. And I think as teachers, we all make mistakes, especially in the early years. And that's normal. And some things we'll regret when we look back afterwards. But as long as we keep exploring and keep searching for the answers, we'll very soon remedy that. The parachute touch is something I've developed over many, many years. And it started off as something, even just a few years ago, it was a very complicated thing, which was called the fundamental hand-arm wrist movement or something, which sounded really, really boring and was difficult for people to remember. And the more I taught it and the more I used it with my students, the more I simplified it. So now it's actually something you can teach your students in 5 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really very simple. The basic touch is you can teach it in 5 minutes. And then after that, you can use it in more and more complex examples. But the first example is just on single notes and on single chords.
Can you show me?
Well, I just so all you're doing initially is just a very simple touch. So we're imagining that I talk about a hot air balloon coming up in the parachute. I'm talking this in very quickly, so it's better to spend a little bit more than 5 minutes on it. But all you're doing is you're really thinking that you're parachuting up and then you're parachuting down and you come down and you land on the note. So you're just doing this movement. And then you start to add in other notes. And then you add in. Now, obviously, you're not going to do it as fast as that with a beginner, but I just wanted to show you how it's a very simple movement, but people think, oh, well, that's only for single notes or for chords, but actually it then leads into it's the movement that we introduce each new melody or each new phrase with this flowing movement, which then frees everything up. It frees up the wrist, it frees up the elbow, so that then the rest of the phrase flows through very easily. The fingers feel light, the wrist is soft, so the whole of the phrase flows really easily. I've taught this to loads of students, hundreds, and they all and often they come to me because their scales aren't even and they're not flowing and they're really struggling with them. And they play this, and suddenly they play a scale, and quite fast. And they say, "Wow, I didn't know I could do that." And it's not what you think. You think that, oh, to get a scale fast, I've got to work really, really hard with my fingers, and I've got to do lots of finger exercises to get my fingers stronger. And actually, often it's just a question of getting the movement to flow, and to use the right muscles at the right time, and actually to keep the wrist soft. And suddenly, the fingers are then freed up to play with much more agility.
I remember you reading through your book and seeing that you've come up with quite a number of alternative fingering solutions for scales and arpeggios as well.
Yes, there are a couple of chapters in the book on this, but actually I wrote a whole book on it
Oh,
25
really?
years ago. Yeah, it's called The Art of Piano Fingering. And that one also came out of frustration. I was teaching a lot of students and their scales weren't even in tone, even in rhythm. And I was looking at their fingerings and I was thinking, but these aren't good fingerings. And they were saying, yeah, but this is what it says in my fingering book. So I took out all the traditional books that we've all been using literally for 100 years. The associated board one has been used for 100 years now. And I realized that a lot of these fingerings just aren't good because they don't put the thumb in the right place. And so they're really producing awkward movements. Have you got a moment? Shall I give an example?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to give the example of the scale of D major. Nearly all of us have been taught that it starts on fifth finger. Yeah, that's the normal fingering that's in most of the books. Now, the problem with doing it with that fingering, when we get to here, the third finger has to come over onto a white note. So there's a tendency for the movement to sort of go like this, right? Then the second isn't in the right position for the C sharp, so we have to do this. And you see quite a lot of that happening when people are playing these scales with this fingering. Now, what is the problem there is that you're turning over the thumb onto a white note. But if we turn over the thumb onto a black note, we haven't got so far to go. Much easier than trying to get over onto a white note. So on a scale coming up, I put the thumb before a black note. So I actually start on the second finger, so that then we're coming over to that. And you see there's very little turning then. It can be a very smooth scale. So compared to, which is what tends to happen, you're just sorry. But it's interesting. I've taught this quite a lot in a lot of classes. And so somebody will come up, there'll be a music college student who's been practicing the old fingering for, 20 years even, 15 years, okay? And And they'll play it, and they're very good pianists, and they'll play the D major with the old fingering, and it's uneven. However good a pianist they are, it's not very even. And I teach them this fingering, so it's fourth finger on F sharp and
Yep.
third on C sharp.
Yep.
They'll practice it 2 or 3 times, they'll play it, and it's better than the fingering that they've been doing all their lives because it fits naturally under the hand. It's what Chopin was using in his fingerings, actually. It's the
Oh,
principles he
really?
was. Yeah. Yeah, he was the first one to really think about this. His fingerings are absolutely just genius. Brilliant
Oh,
fingerings.
really?
Yeah, yeah. And so these fingers, so the sort of, if we get really good fingerings, we solve 40% of the musical problems.
Mm.
Because so many awkward passages, they're struggling with them, and you take it away and you say, well, actually, how about using this fingering instead? And suddenly it's resolved.
We have a lot of Talman teachers in Australia. And would you say that this book would be a complementary approach to a Talman approach?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm an admirer of Talman. I didn't learn from a Talman teacher, and I only really came across her work just recently when I'd written my book and was trying to assess it against other books, make sure that I wasn't contradicting a lot of other people and so on. And I think she was a great teacher and a great lady, real character too.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of what she teaches is really, really good. I use quite a lot of rotation in the book, but I also use a lot of up and down movements, side to side movements. I use a lot of rounded movements. I do use a little bit more sideways wrist swiveling than she uses. Um, and of course, it's this book is very, very fat. I mean, the first two-thirds is probably, the first half is about technique. All the rest is how we put that into practice in musical examples, and it's about harmony, phrasing, um, melodic shaping, rhythm, pedaling, how we study, how we practice.
Mm.
Um, so the intention in writing this book was to make it the most comprehensive book on
Mm.
piano playing, to cover virtually everything. And that's what
Hence
we've tried
its
to do.
hence its name, the complete piano.
Yes. Yeah, and it started off as rather smaller, but Peter's edition were very keen for me to really extend it and to try and cover as much as anything. What teachers will find, for instance, is there are some things, for instance, I've done a chapter on practicing, and then I've done a chart which can be photocopied, you're allowed to photocopy it, which is a practice chart that you can use for your students.
Mm.
Um, some things like that are really quite useful for the teachers in it.
So, Penelope, would you have one suggestion, one easy suggestion that you could give to beginner teachers or teachers that may not be as experienced as yourself?
Um, I think two suggestions. Okay, one is never stop learning. Um, I'm still learning. I'm still trying out new ways. I'm still experimenting with all my students because each student is different, and each student needs a slightly different approach. And the more experience we have, the more we're able to adapt to each student and help them individually. So I think that's the first thing.
Hmm.
And secondly, um, my book, when I first started writing it, was called Towards Effortless Piano Playing. And I think if students are playing with ease, with comfort, if it feels easy for them, they will develop really quickly. They'll have real enthusiasm. And they'll approach their pieces and think, yes, I can do this.
Mm.
And so the more you can develop strategies for whenever they've got a problem, saying, how can I make this easier for them? I'm not saying just give them easy pieces all the time. I'm saying give them more challenging pieces. But say they're starting to do some rotation movement, going back to the Talman method, they're learning some rotation. Don't wait until you've given them the piece before, and they've struggled with it for 3 weeks to then introduce how to do rotation. Think in advance and say, right, I want to give somebody this piece. I know it's going to have rotation. I know it's going to have an E flat major scale in it. And I know it's going to have this. So think a little bit in ahead and think, well, I can give them some really simple exercises to get their rotation really good so that when they come to it in this piece, they'll feel I can do that. And I think that's what all our students need, is that feeling I can do it, isn't it? And that's what we need.
It's a wonderful suggestion. What's next for you, Penelope?
Well, I thought that this book was going to be the end of my writing, um, but Peter's Edition have suggested that I do a book which is much smaller, which is aimed for beginners, and so I'm going to be working on that. But actually, what might be more interesting to your viewers is that I'm starting up a teacher training course on teaching mostly the technical aspects of technique, but of course, every aspect of technique feeds into musicianship. So there'll be a lot of musical discussion, obviously,
Mm.
as well. And it started off as a face to face 4 weekends in the year course, but it's going to go online um, as a in time sort of one with some actual Zoom meetings, but also there's going to be one which is available for anybody to access just in their own time. Um, it's going to take some time to get this all set up. Um, but I have a website, so if anybody wants to sort of subscribe to the website, for instance, then they'll be sent out some information near the time when it's actually ready, if anybody's interested in having a look at
And
that.
that's Penelope Roskell
Co.uk.
.co.uk.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Lovely to meet you.